Did Africa miss the opportunity of the last commodities boom? Kojo Busia is coordinator of the African Minerals Development Center, responsible for the implementation of the African Mining Vision. He joins us today to talk about the state of Africa in the aftermath of the great commodity boom. Kojo, welcome to Raw Talks.
Thank you very much.
Ten years ago, Africa was the new hot topic and the new hope for the global economy. And analysts, from The Economist to McKinsey, found deep-rooted fundamentals for this enthusiasm. And it wasn't just about the commodities. In your view, is Africa generating the same sort of enthusiasm among investors today?
Yes and no, in the sense that there are a group of countries that continue to attract investors' interest. And of course, because of the commodity crunch, there are a number of countries as well who the hopes and the enthusiasm that initially greeted the African rising story is no longer the case. If you take, for example, countries like Guinea or Sierra Leone, there are a number of greenfield projects that didn't come to fruition, partly because of the commodity collapse of commodity prices. But traditional countries like Ghana, Tanzania, Mozambique, Burkina Faso and Mali that traditionally have investments in commodities continues to generate.
So more mature mining countries are still generating enthusiasm.
Absolutely.
The IMF portrays a sharp picture of Africa coming out of the boom. Basically a continent split in two, half resource dependent, half not. The former doing poorly and the latter doing rather well. Is this a reflection of lower commodity prices, or is there something else to it?
I think there's something more fundamental. It points to the whole idea of what we call a revenue maximization paradigm of the commodity sector, whereby countries that are resource rich depends entirely on the revenues that comes with the high commodity prices without investing adequately in other sectors of the economy, i.e. diversifying and so on. So when the crunch comes, these countries are not able to sustain themselves because there are no savings and not investments in infrastructure and less diversification. Now, for countries that are not resource dependent, we've seen something else. And these are countries that are trying to diversify the economies, oftentimes away from agriculture dependency.
Can you give me some examples of
I think Ethiopia and Rwanda gives us a very good example of how countries can incentivize industrialization, value addition to some extent, and really sort of prepare the economies for more diversified outlook. So structurally, I think this points to the fact that commodity-dependent countries ought to do something differently. In other words, preparing themselves for more local content, more value addition, which will then absorb some of the shocks in the cases of commodity price crunches.
In these economic cycles, we do tend to see a pattern. Extraordinary revenues fueling consumption boom and higher public expenditure, leading to fiscal deficits and financing difficulties. Do you see African governments taking actions to rectify these imbalances?
The same paradigm, as I mentioned earlier, of depending entirely on revenues as opposed to investing in the future of the economy is something that is becoming very clear that approach doesn't work very well.
But I'm wondering, because this is a cyclical industry and everyone knew really that the supercycle would come down at some point. But did the bust take the governments by surprise?
You're taken by surprise only if you don't invest in the future. In other words, if you don't manage revenues adequately, most countries tend to resort to consumption, operational expenditures, and not enough capital investments. And obviously that doesn't work. So countries that were able to somehow establish sovereign wealth funds and other similar mechanisms were able to absorb the shocks better.
And do you see that as the biggest lesson takeaway now from what is happening after the supercycle, that investment is what will matter?
Absolutely. Investments in research and development and other linkages of the economy, including the supply chains of the mining sector, that ultimately will sustain the economy in the times of such commodity crunch.
Are African governments working together to improve this moving forward and prepare for the next boom, maybe?
Increasingly, we see countries that are making the necessary reforms because of the downturn, perhaps, and preparing for the next boom. These are countries that are reforming their mineral regimes, putting in place policies and incentives for industrialization of the other sort of sectors that are related to the mining sector, that hopefully in the future will be able to not only help attract investments because they offer themselves as competitive service or supply provision to the sector, and hopefully that will be a good strategy to offset any future collapse of the commodity market.
Let's talk about investment. The winds of change are blowing and global investors are becoming more selective, more risk averse. What are African governments doing to remain attractive?
Well, I think countries ought to make sure that they have a competitive investment climate. I think we need to look beyond tax incentives and look more at providing competitiveness in the context of how do we invest in the service sector, for example, that can then become competitive in attracting investments in the commodity sector. In other words, if a country has competitive supply chain, I think investors will be more interested in investing in that country. It reduces the cost of the mining development. As you know, mining is a highly intensive, has inputs, capital and other services. And I think increasingly mining companies would have to depend on local procurement and local services rather than importing all their inputs. I think beyond the tax incentives, which has traditionally been the advice that African governments have received, now countries are looking at diversifying, improving the environment, that means the service sector, and future supply chains that can help mining companies to be globally competitive.
Here is a fact I find quite interesting. During the boom, most new production in Africa came from brownfield rather than greenfield, meaning expansion of existing projects rather than developing new projects. But this means that many of the largest and best resources in Africa remain untapped. What needs to happen for these projects to materialize?
Increasingly, governments are realizing that you have to leverage your resources with infrastructure, investments, and other related sectors. And some of these greenfield projects were basically stalled by some of the negotiations because of these linkages.
Was that a case of governments being too greedy, that they wanted too much?
Well, I think it's a reflection on the shift in how resource development is going to take place. Increasingly, most governments are linking their resources with other productive sectors of the economy so that in times of commodity price collapse, there will be some other related benefits and linkages that can help the economy sustain this commodity price collapse. So that's a reflection of that, besides the global market as well. So these greenfields would have to be shelved increasingly in most countries. But I think one would expect that once the boom comes back, increasingly some of these projects will be revived.
Is infrastructure one of the things that you see as key for these projects to materialize? They need infrastructure, they need big railways, a lot of things that needs to be built.
Most governments agree that you have to link your resource development with infrastructure.
It requires a lot of money though, a lot of capital.
And the issue is who's going to pay for it. And I think most governments, well, the international community in general, is beginning to find answers. The financing mechanisms, the issue of multiple users, third-party usage of infrastructure, what does it mean for the project itself, and so on. But I think increasingly, the international community is beginning to accept that this is part and parcel of resource development.
We mentioned earlier the IMF report and resource-rich countries doing poorly and non-resource dependent countries are doing better. Are there lessons to be learned by resource-rich countries from the non-resource-rich countries in how they have now gone into a sustained growth trajectory?
I think the key lesson is for resource-dependent economies to realize that these resources are finite. One has to plan accordingly through mechanisms that will sustain the economy post-boom periods. And that includes investments in infrastructure, in other related sectors, in the service sector to make it more competitive, but also to have better revenue management systems in the context of savings, in sovereign wealth funds that ought to be managed carefully so that countries can absorb the shocks in the times of commodity collapse.
Is it more important to diversify within the mining so you're not dependent on one specific commodity, or do you see diversifying away from mining?
The idea of diversifying within the sector is to link the development of the resource to other productive sectors, whether it's in the form of infrastructure that can have a multiplier impact on other sectors, but also in human capital, in services, in skill development, in technology and research that can ultimately have spillover impact on related sectors.
And can you mention a country that has done this?
Increasingly, we are beginning to see countries like Ghana, countries like perhaps a little bit of Tanzania, or in the petroleum and gas sector, there are more sort of experiences to talk about.
So they are ahead of the mining countries?
Absolutely. In the petroleum and gas sector, increasingly we are beginning to see more local content, more sort of supply chains being developed, and so on. Mining is a little bit lagged, partly because of the history of mining. Traditionally, it has long gestation periods. It's more seen as capital intensive in the beginning, and countries traditionally did not focus on local content or even linkages, and solely focus on the revenues. But increasingly, I think countries are realizing that they need to plan for mining investments and now creating the necessary environment, the policies, and incentives that will drive the mining sector in the future.
One of the most exciting developments coming out of Africa in the past decade, and that is the African Mining Vision. It's a progressive framework for the mining sector in Africa, but admittedly, it was conceived in a world of high prices and sustained demand from China. Has the vision kept relevant in today's world?
I think the experience of the last decade has actually made the African Mining Vision even more relevant, because a key message of the African Mining Vision is that countries that are resource dependent, particularly mining, ought to invest in the linkages of the mining sector to the rest of the economy. And now that we see the commodity crunch, we see that countries are struggling because they did not heed this advice in the middle of the commodity boom and excitement. Countries were, concerned solely about getting agreements and sort of cashing in the revenues. But I think with the current collapse, we realize that if countries had invested enough in the linkages, had sort of improved their supply chains, I think they would have been better off than before. So
the African Mining Vision was more prepared for the bust than the government?
I think so. I think the African Mining Vision foresaw the bust. It was implemented on the heels of the commodity boom, but it warned countries that the boom should not be an end in itself, and that countries ought to look beyond the boom, invest in linkages that will help them in times of, because the sector is a cyclical, and I think the vision recognizes that, and that's precisely the reason why it advises governments to be able to do that. But the good news is that increasingly countries are beginning to put in place, one way or the other, policies that will help them in the next cycle to absorb some of the shocks. So that's quite an exciting news. For the African Mineral Development Center, at least we have 1 out of 2 African countries it's involved in reforming their mineral regimes, putting in place local content, value addition policies that increasingly will help countries to absorb the shocks in the future. So I think the AMV is as relevant as it were some 8-9 years ago when it was first mooted.
Do you see the focus on linkages as the number one thing where the African mining vision has made most progress and where it is most relevant?
I think so. It's not the only thing, but it's a core.
There are more to it than just the linkages part.
Absolutely. It spans across the entire value chain, putting in place the policies, the regulatory frameworks, but also enhancing the linkages, as well as some of the investments in capacity building, human capital, and so on. But
How do you take it from a vision down to that level? How do you implement it in countries?
It's flexible enough to recognize the different contexts that countries find their countries in, and they are able to adapt in terms of what the key message of the vision is into national laws and into national strategies that will help them to absorb some of the shocks in the future. So that's what increasingly we're doing, giving countries advice. Countries are reforming based on the vision of the African mining vision at the country level.
What do you see has been the most difficult part so far, and what do you see for the future of the African mining vision?
Because of the commodity crunch, countries are still focusing on revenues. On the other hand, you have some actors in countries who want the long-term implementation of the vision. So you still have this, partly because of changing governments as well.
So the political economy is a bit difficult.
And the lack of coordination within agencies in countries. You have ministries, minerals commissions, chambers of mines. Some of these actors are not always coherent. The African mining vision is as relevant as ever, simply because the message of the vision is that countries ought to invest other than just depending on revenues. They ought to link the mining sector with other productive sectors of the economy.
Kojo, thank you very much for joining Raw Talks.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
And to keep up with the new debate on extractives and development, join us on rawtalks.org.